Today, we're going to be settling an age-old debate of how much RAM do you actually need, and the best part is, we're actually going to be looking at how much you need for DDR4 and for DDR5.
And shout out to G.Skill for sponsoring this video and making it possible. A few years ago, we did a video of how much RAM you need for gaming, and you guys really loved that video, so we decided to make a refresh to see what has changed going into 2025 in terms of how much RAM you need. And of course, if you're building a gaming PC and you need some RAM, G.Skill is a great option for you with their Ripjaws memory. They also have their Trident Z memory. We have DDR5 and DDR4 here from G.Skill. They have all the options you need, whether you're on a budget or you want the top of the line RAM. You definitely want to check out G.Skill for your next PC build. So check those links down below, and shout again to G.Skill for sponsoring this video. What we're going to go ahead and do is talk about how this video is going to go. We're trying to make it as concise as possible for a pretty complex topic. So we're going to explain what this video is, what it isn't, and then dive into some testing.
So once again, this video is not going to be comparing DDR4 versus DDR5. That's a whole separate video. This is really just showing how much RAM capacity you actually need for DDR4 and DDR5.
And to do so, we have two different test stations. Over here, we have an AM4 test station, which is the main reason people are buying DDR4 memory, rocking a Ryzen 7 5800X and the RAM we're going to be putting into it with a B550 motherboard. And then our test bench right here is our normal GPU test bench with an AM5 system with a Ryzen 7 7700X and a B650 motherboard, and all the RAM we're going to be putting inside it.
And in our AM4 build, we have the RTX 4060, and then in our AM5 build, we're using the RX 7700 XT.
So we'll leave all the links down below to all the RAM that we use in this video, but we're gonna be testing 16, 32, and 64 gigabytes on DDR4, and we're gonna be testing 32, 48, and 64 gigabytes on DDR5, and all the settings we run will be located in the description down below. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive straight into the testing and see how much RAM you need for gaming in 2024 going into 2025, maybe even 2026 and beyond. Alright guys, now that we introed this video, explained our testing methodology, and shout out G.Skill for sponsoring this video, we're going to go ahead and dive into the results. Now, on our YouTube channel, second YouTube channel, Toasty Clips, we're going to post all of these benchmarks unedited in one video where you can watch them through yourself. This video is going to be a way for us to condense everything into a more, well, digestible package so you guys can understand the results and decide how much RAM you think you actually need for gaming. So we're going to go ahead and dive into it game by game. The games we decided to test are Black Myth Wukong. We also have Cyberpunk. Those are control games with built-in benchmarks, so we can run those benchmarks over and over again and have no changes in variables. And then we threw in Fortnite and Warzone, which again, we tried our best to drop in the same locations and at the same time, but those variables are a little bit uncontrolled. It's just a way for you guys to see the gameplay with your own eyes to determine what you think the performance is going to be like. Now let's go ahead and start with Black Myth Wukong using DDR4 memory. We're going to go down the list real quick. 16 gigs got an average of 50 FPS, a max of 58, and a minimum of 13. 32 gigabytes got an average of 52 FPS, a max of 59, and a minimum of 43. And 64 gigabytes got an average of 52 FPS, a max of 59, and a minimum of 43. So as you can see here, 16 gigs to 32 gigabytes, there was a slight uplift in average and max FPS, but that's kind of within margin of error, 2 FPS, not really worth upgrading your RAM for that. It's really the minimums where we see a big jump, and we see that with DDR5 as well, which we'll talk about here in a second. When running 16 gigs, yes, if you have nothing running in the background, those minimums may be, well, a little bit higher. You might have that stutter that happens, but when you are using your PC and you have stuff installed in the background, you have Wallpaper Engine, you have Steam open, you have some sort of messaging app open, you're gonna start getting stutters because you're hitting the limit of the amount of RAM that you have. Jumping to 32 gigs, as you can tell, does make a big difference. So if you are somebody who, well, is on a budget, 16 gigs still works, but if you start experiencing stutters that you can't, well, ignore and are really bothering you, maybe upgrading your RAM, if everything else in your system is still solid, might be worth it. Now let's talk about the DDR5 results. At 32 gigabytes, we got an average of 71 FPS, a max of 86, and a minimum of 21. At 48 gigabytes, we got an average of 71 FPS, a max of 85, and a minimum of 54. And at 64 gigabytes, we got an average of 71 FPS, a max of 86, a minimum of 58. Now you see the same thing here. The averages, same across the board from 32 to 64, but you actually see a jump going from 32 to 48 gigabytes in DDR5. That's a little bit weird in my opinion, because I would have thought that it would have been the same, where 32 gigabytes DDR5 would be the same as 32 gigabytes DDR4. That could just be some testing errors. It does happen with this testing. We ran the benchmarks multiple times and got the same results. So for whatever reason, probably timings related, because 48 gigabytes has slightly better timings than 32 gigabytes. We do get slightly slightly better minimums, which again, you want that if you want to have a constant smooth experience. But across the board for DDR5, I think 48 gigabytes is a good option because it's just a little more expensive than 32. Get a little bit more peace of mind, but honestly, if you are on an entry-level DDR5 option, 32 is fine, and you might not see some of the lows that we had in Black Myth Wukong in other games. All right, guys, let's move on to Cyberpunk. Let's go DDR4. 16 gigabytes, we get an average of 92.46 FPS, a max of 110.67, and a minimum of 79.51. 32 gigabytes, we got an average of 92.88 frames per second, we got a max of 111.36, and a minimum of 79.76. 64 gigabytes, we got 92.95 FPS average, a max of 111.42, and a minimum of 79.78. This was a test where you really don't see a major jump at all. Everything across the board is fine. Cyberpunk, compared to the other game we test, Wukong, is slightly older, so 16 gigs of DDR4 seems to be perfectly fine. Very straightforward. We'll go ahead and dive into DDR5 as well. 32 gigabytes, 133 FPS, a max of 158, and a minimum of 114. 48 gigabytes, an average of 132, a max of 157, and a minimum of 112. And 64 gigabytes, an average of 133, a max of 159, and a minimum of 114. We still see that weirdness where 48 gigabytes has slightly lower minimums. I really do think it has to come down to the timings of the 48 gigabyte kit that we do have. It's slightly slower than our 32 gigabyte kit, so when capacity isn't the problem, you really want to find the kit with the best speed. But again, we're talking 2 FPS here. It's not a major difference. I think across the board, Cyberpunk, 16 gigs is perfectly fine, and if you want a little more wiggle room, 32 makes a whole lot of sense. Now let's talk about the games, again, that are not perfect benchmarks, but you guys can see some live gameplay of Fortnite and Warzone. First up in Fortnite with DDR4 memory, 16 gigabytes, we saw an average of about 215 to 220 FPS with some lows into the 150 range every so often. Then when we go to 32 gigabytes, we saw those averages go up a decent amount, around 220 to 230 with a low of 190 FPS. And then at 64 gigabytes, we saw about the same average, 230 FPS, but around 180 on the low end. This drop had a ton of people though, so that does drop the FPS a decent amount. Again, we tried to run this multiple times to replicate the same scenario, but in a game like Fortnite, there's a lot of stuff happening at the same time. But across the board, I think the data still shows the same thing that we saw in Black Myth Wukong with DDR4. Going 32 gigabytes helps improve those low FPS numbers, but you don't necessarily need to go 32 gigabytes to play Fortnite. It's just if you have a lot of stutters and you're, let's say, running maybe even higher settings or running more background tasks, going to 32 gigabytes would make sense even on a budget PC like this. But you could still definitely get away with 16 and have a very smooth gaming experience, because the difference between 150 FPS and 190 for most average gamers is not going to make a big difference. Now let's do DDR5, 32 gigabytes. We got an average of 340 FPS with a low of about 285. 48 gigabytes, we saw the same weirdness with the timings here, getting an average of 300 FPS with a low of 200. And with 64 gigabytes, an average of 330 FPS with a low of 200. So realistically, a really fast kit of 32 gigabytes is honestly going to be better for a game like Fortnite versus larger capacity with worse timings. So going 32 gigabytes might make a lot of sense, but in terms of capacity, if you could get a 48 gig capacity with the same timings as 32, go for it. You probably won't see a major difference. Same with 64. So really my recommendation for DDR5 would have to be 32 gigabytes with the best possible speed, and you have a great experience in Fortnite. And lastly, in Warzone, we decided to drop to the same location on Warzone Resurgence Duos. And first up with DDR4 16 gigabytes, we got 130 FPS on average, with 105 being the low. At 32 gigabytes, we got 130 FPS average with 110 being the low. And on 64 gigabytes, 130 FPS on average with 110 being the low. Pretty much across the board, we gain slightly more FPS going to 32 gigabytes. Warzone's a game that you actually see the RAM being used more, but the FPS doesn't change a whole lot. I think we're definitely limited by the actual GPU and CPU performance here versus the RAM. So in this configuration, going 16 gigs is perfectly fine. Once you start getting into more multitasking, I imagine that 105 FPS low is probably going to get a little bit lower. So opt for 32 gigabytes if you can. DDR5, pretty much the same story. Average of 180 FPS with a low of 140 with 32 gigabytes. At 48, we got the same timings weirdness, average of 170 FPS with a low of 140. And then at 64 gigabytes, average of 180 with a low of 140. Same deal across the board. Get a really fast 32 gigabyte kit and you'll have no problems whatsoever in a game like Warzone. Now, I know that was a ton of data to digest, and this was the best way for us to present it in a quick and, well, kind of efficient manner so you guys get the general consensus. But that general consensus being, if you're on a budget, 16 gigabytes is still perfectly fine for DDR4, but you will experience some stutters jitters and 1% lows that might cause some problems in newer games like Black Myth Wukong. But if you're mainly playing Fortnite and Warzone, you're still good with 16 gigabytes. But if you have the money to spend, 32 will make a good difference. But if it's a difference between you getting a slightly better GPU and more RAM, I would definitely still lean into the better GPU department and upgrade your RAM later. DDR5, 48 gigabytes is good if you get a kit with really good timings like the 32 gigabyte kit we have here. The 48 gigabyte kit isn't bad, it just doesn't have the best timings that we need for it to compete very closely with the 32 gigabyte kit. So I would really recommend still 32 for DDR5 and 32 for DDR4, 16 being the budget option. That is still more than acceptable, but it was still interesting to see how much difference there was in the lows in terms of the FPS averages when you go from 16 to 32 on DDR4, and across the board on DDR5, it really didn't matter all that much depending on the system. So now that we've gone over all this data as concisely as possible, once again, if you want to see all our testing methodology, links in the description down below. We'll go over how we tested each game, the settings we ran at, and all that sort of fun stuff, and also a link to toasted clips so you guys can see the full gameplay footage in your own time. You can digest it however you like. Link down below. Let's go and bring Jackson back in here and we'll wrap this video up real quick.
All right, guys, that was a lot of testing. There was a lot of RAM that was not harmed in this video, but the consensus is pretty interesting. Basically, we're not using 8 gigs of RAM anymore like the old RAM video. We started off at 16 on our DDR4 platform, and the biggest difference that we saw was the fact that each time you go up in RAM capacity, you get better lows, meaning in new games like Black Myth Wukong, instead of getting, let's say, 16 FPS minimums, you're gonna be getting more like 40 to 50 FPS minimums.
And that still doesn't mean 16 gigabytes doesn't make sense for a AM4 system like this or any budget system. It still is great, especially at the price, but if you're wanting to play those higher end games and not mainly esports titles, as you saw in the other games we tested, it really didn't make that big of a difference. You definitely want to opt for 32 gigs, but I think we feel very confident in saying 16 gigs is still fine for DDR4 if you have a little bit more money. 32 gigabytes is the way to go, and if you're going DDR5, 32 gigabytes is still more than enough for pretty much all gamers out there, but if you want to get, well, a little bit more RAM for, let's say, live streaming or multitasking, 40 gigabytes makes sense, but we got to talk about the cache latency issue that does come with that.
So of course there's 3 main components with RAM: capacity, cache latency or timing, and then the frequency. So it's important to look when you're buying something like this G.Skill RAM, you want to get something like some CL30 if you're going DDR5, because if you go to like CL48, for example, even though you have more capacity and maybe even the same megahertz, they may both be 6,000, you're gonna probably see some less FPS with those slower cache latencies.
And when it comes to RAM, there's a lot of things to consider, not just capacity, which is the focus of this video, the timings and everything, the speed in terms of going DDR4 versus DDR5, is there actually a difference? We may do some other videos in the future we dive into more in-depth stuff like that. But again, in terms of raw capacity, we think the data is pretty solid and something you should definitely consider. And big shout out again to G.Skill for sponsoring this video. If you want to buy some awesome RAM for your next gaming PC, DDR4 or DDR5, check the links down below and buy some G.Skill memory today.
So as always, we hope you guys enjoyed today's scientific video. If you did, check out our other 2 YouTube channels and also our twitch.tv/toastybros, and do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
And we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.
Now, if you don't want to have to worry about watching this whole video and then having to go watch 8 other videos, just check out PCBros.tech. We like to optimize our builds based on the price to have the proper amount of RAM each time.
PCBros.tech, budget builds with 16 gigs or high-end builds with 64 gigs of DDR5 memory. We got you covered. Use code ToastyBros on checkout. You'll save 3% on your next purchase. 2-3. See you guys later. Goodbye.